The message didn't arrive quietly, it struck like a sentence handed down after a secret meeting. My name is Clara Reynolds. I'm 34 years old, and until that morning in autumn 2021, I genuinely believed I still belonged to my own family. The announcement came through our family group chat, not in a private message, not with compassion, but in front of everyone whose opinions I had spent years trying to respect. My father, Martin, typed words that still echo sharply when I think about them. "We've decided you should step away for now." No explanation, no gentle follow-up, just a clean directive to disappear from a space I had spent years propping up emotionally and financially. My mother, Janet, said nothing in the chat. Her silence felt heavier than any accusation. I stared at the glowing screen for several seconds, refusing to plead, refusing to justify myself in public, refusing to fight for a place I had already earned through sacrifice. My reply was calm and final. "Understood. I'll step away from the family entirely." A moment later, my younger sister, Evelyn, reacted to my message with a confetti emoji. That tiny symbol told me more about her loyalty than any sentence ever had. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I walked into my home office, opened the investment account that existed because of my credit, my signatures, my long nights solving their problems. My breathing stayed steady, almost too steady. And there, quiet, precise, I made one irreversible decision. I liquidated the $312,000 investment fund I had built for them over the last decade. They wanted me gone. So I left right along with the financial safety net they never acknowledged. Before we go further, and before you hear how deep this fracture went, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. What happened after that text reshaped everything I understood about loyalty, boundaries, and the cost of being the dependable one. Long before the message arrived, our family was already unraveling. The Reynolds household revolved around our beachfront barbecue stand in San Diego, a once-beloved spot where locals lined up for ribs, smoked fish, and grilled corn dripping with butter. For years, summers kept us afloat, and winters brought manageable slowdowns. But in recent seasons, decline came fast, too fast, for anyone to prepare for. Suppliers pulled back on flexible terms, utility bills piled up in drawers, foot traffic dropped until the cash register felt more like a museum piece than a working tool. Mom panicked first, though not productively. She drifted through the restaurant, tightening her jaw, flipping through unpaid invoices, as if numbers might rearrange themselves into something less frightening. Dad, on the other hand, spiraled in the opposite direction. He ordered far more inventory than we could store, signed high-interest bridge loans without reading the fine print, and offered discounts we couldn't afford just to lure customers back. And the whole time, I cleaned up paperwork, patched relationships with vendors, repaired credit lines, and found solutions while they insisted everything was fine. It wasn't fine. And their message proved they were ready to push me out right when they needed me most. When my parents spoke during those chaotic months, it felt less like leadership and more like fear masquerading as authority. And even though they never admitted it, the pressure was shifting onto everyone, especially onto my younger sister, Evelyn. She was suddenly framed as the family's creative mind, the one who would revive the seafood stand through social media campaigns, influencer partnerships, and glossy rebranding ideas that sounded ambitious but never materialized. Evelyn talked a lot, but she never altered her schedule, never stayed after closing, never dealt with an angry vendor who wanted payment yesterday. The distance between us didn't arrive in one sharp moment, it crept in slowly, almost silently. But I felt it. Every week, every conversation, she drifted further away from the weight of responsibility and closer to the comfort of being uninvolved. At that time, I had my own goals plans that required savings, relocation, and a calm mind. But because the family was drowning, I shelved them without announcement. I didn't ask for applause, and I expected none. After my day job, I would head straight to the stand, sit in the back office, and quietly study the numbers. What trickled in, what streamed out, what bled through the cracks no one wanted to look at. I never asked for ownership. I never asked for a title. I certainly never asked for gratitude. The first time I sent money, it wasn't dramatic. I didn't call a family meeting or craft a speech. I simply saw the ledger, calculated how many days we had before rent became a threat, and wired enough to keep the business alive a little longer. No one knew. I treated it like tightening a bolt before a structure collapsed. But that was also the moment I stopped helping from the sidelines. Quietly, methodically, I began rebuilding what my parents refused to manage. I created basic tracking systems, grouping bills by urgency. I renegotiated vendor schedules, redirecting payments so penalties didn't wipe us out. I called suppliers myself, promising what I could realistically deliver and refusing to make promises we couldn't keep. Without ceremony, I became the unseen scaffolding holding the restaurant upright. By the time I noticed how embedded I had become, stepping back felt impossible. By the start of the second summer, nothing meaningful happened without my input. The restaurant began breathing again, not because fortune shifted, but because someone finally stayed awake, paying attention to the details everyone else kept avoiding. Days stopped feeling unpredictable. Every delay, every broken piece of equipment, every invoice had a pathway and a decision behind it. The voice guiding those decisions wasn't loud, but it was unwavering. It was mine. Seafood suppliers were the first wall I had to push through. Conversations turned tense fast. Unpaid balances don't soften when a family looks exhausted. I learned to speak firmly without apology, to negotiate time without deception, to explain real numbers without exposing weakness. Then came the equipment battles, freezers that quit at the worst moments, stoves demanding repairs, rental companies tired of excuses. Contracts had to be rewritten, fees contested, terms renegotiated. One signature at a time. I kept us alive. Penalty clauses were negotiated into softer terms. Overdue fees, once sharp and threatening, were stretched into manageable timelines. Every conversation required composure, even when my hands curled tight beneath the desk. Every agreement required quiet pressure, even while my voice stayed calm. The debts did not vanish, but at least they stopped spreading unchecked. Balances that everyone else had ignored for months were pulled into clean, organized lists. Numbers stopped being shadows lurking in drawers and became direct problems laid in front of me, problems I could finally address. I no longer treated our finances like storms destined to pass or disasters too overwhelming to confront. I treated them like broken pipes. They needed someone to grip the valve and stop the flood. That mindset shifted everything. Through all this, Evelyn didn't exactly disappear. She simply floated through the crisis in a different orbit. Her presence lived through cheerful updates and polished smiles reserved for social media. Whenever a camera was nearby, she became the face of the Reynolds revival. Work never touched her hands, but attention always did. Compliments drifted toward her effortlessly. Questions about the restaurant's direction seemed directed at her, even when the real decisions had come from me. Meanwhile, the pressure stayed anchored on my shoulders. Something inside me hardened during those months, not anger, not jealousy, but a quiet separation, a kind of emotional step back that didn't need an announcement. My parents began leaning on me without ever saying so plainly. Decisions slid toward my side of the table. Bills waited for my review before they moved. Vendors reached out to my phone directly. Responsibility stopped being framed as help and instead became an unspoken expectation. Everyone relied on me, but no one named it. What changed most wasn't the workload, it was the silence around it. Appreciation never appeared in warm words. Gratitude didn't become routine. There were no celebratory dinners, no acknowledgments, no moments of softness to balance out the strain. There was only an unspoken truth. Things worked when I handled them, and they unraveled when I didn't. And then, just as the business began breathing normally again, the tone inside our family shifted. I noticed it first through compliments that landed in unexpected places directed toward Evelyn, even though nothing material had changed in her contributions. Warmth poured in her direction, while silence pooled quietly around me. There was no confrontation, no explicit decision. Just a subtle repositioning of attention that felt intentional without ever being admitted. Dad, Martin, started speaking about Evelyn with a pride that sounded rehearsed. He praised her leadership in front of staff. He talked about her instincts when guests were around. He repeated her name in meetings where my presence went unacknowledged. Mom, Janet, followed his lead. Her lingering smiles helped feed the narrative, one where Evelyn appeared to be the guiding force rather than an observer. Each retelling made the story stronger. On the outside, I stayed steady. Inside, I watched a new version of reality being carefully handed to others as if it had always belonged to her. And beyond the restaurant walls, Evelyn embraced that narrative with ease, shaping it, polishing it, and owning it. Evelyn leaned fully into the role she'd crafted, speaking to vendors with practiced ease, explaining the business to curious visitors as if she had carried the weight from the beginning. She described my involvement as something light, something supportive, something optional. The first time I heard someone thank her for a financial decision I had fought through alone at 2 in the morning, I understood the truth. This wasn't confusion. This was a rewrite. The story wasn't shifting, it was being replaced. One afternoon, our floor manager, Luis, approached me with a quiet seriousness that made my stomach drop before he even spoke. He wasn't nervous, just cautious, as if measuring every syllable. He explained that he had been instructed not to bring operational reports to me anymore. Structural changes had been discussed without me. New chains of command had been put in place. All without my knowledge. He asked me to be patient. The request felt hollow when the space I built was being taken from me inch by inch. The storage area behind the kitchen, cramped aisles, stacked with bulk spices and boxes of takeout containers, became a strange pocket of truth. People wandered through speaking freely, assuming they had privacy. Their voices carried further than they realized. I heard my name said without warmth, my role minimized into something temporary, emotional, unnecessary. The words didn't hurt because they were harsh, they hurt because they were delivered so casually, so confidently, as though facts instead of distortions. I didn't correct them. I didn't step out from behind the shelf and announce what was real. I simply absorbed the silence that wrapped around me while the foundation I had built was quietly stripped away. Meetings were suddenly held without my knowledge, chairs filled with people who had once sought my guidance. Calendars were changed and I no longer had access. Conversations stopped abruptly the moment I walked into a room, as if my presence interfered with a new script being rehearsed. My phone, once constantly ringing with problems only I could solve, went still. This wasn't losing credit. It was erasure, slow, polite, devastating. No one said I was no longer needed. No confrontation. No raised voices. They simply stopped turning toward me, stopped acknowledging my involvement, stopped treating me like someone who mattered. The quietness of it made the damage sharper. I stayed silent longer than was reasonable, not because I lacked strength, but because I feared that defending myself would destroy what little ground I still occupied. Pride didn't drive me. Anger didn't push me. Fear lived in the background, convincing me that calm was safer than truth. So I kept working in whatever corners were left to me, watching the story drift farther from reality with every passing week. By the time others noticed how deeply things had changed, the shift had already settled inside me. Something had closed. Something had ended. And then, one quiet Sunday night, my phone buzzed in a tone I will never forget. A notification appeared. Ordinary, unhurried, free of tension. But its content would fracture everything that came after. The notification looked ordinary, yet it carried a weight heavier than any argument I had endured over the years. I had been sitting alone, revisiting the familiar checklist in my mind: outstanding balances, supplier delays, shifting inventory numbers, and the quiet responsibility that had followed me for years, even though no one had ever formally assigned it to me. When my phone buzzed, I reached for it without emotion, expecting another small issue, another question, another quiet burden that would land in my lap without acknowledgement. A part of me still believed my role in the family was understood, even if never spoken aloud. I believed loyalty held some invisible value, something that could not be erased with a single moment of convenience. But before I could scroll, I saw the words already waiting, precise, emotionless, almost premeditated. "We've decided you should step away for now." It was from Dad. Sent directly into our family group chat, the same thread where holiday plans used to circulate, where problems were casually dropped for me to solve, where my input was once requested only at the final hour when everything hinged on the right decision. Now, That same space delivered a verdict without warmth, without hesitation, without even the courtesy of pretending it was mutual. It felt official, processed, like something that had been discussed in a room I was not welcome to enter. A room where my name had been mentioned, but my voice had not. And in that moment, it became painfully clear that I hadn't been part of the room, any room, for a very long time. There was no follow-up message, no clarifying sentence, no softening attempt. Mom stayed completely silent. And her silence felt deliberate, not passive like a quiet signature on a document I was never allowed to see. Her lack of disagreement told me everything. It wasn't confusion, it wasn't impulsive. It was coordinated. I reread the message slowly, not because I struggled to interpret it, but because its clarity stung. This wasn't an invitation for conversation. This wasn't a moment of uncertainty. It was a finished decision, approved somewhere out of sight, and delivered without hesitation. So, I responded carefully, choosing calm over emotion, clarity over explanation, self-respect over reaction. I'll respect that, and step away from the family entirely. I didn't justify anything. I didn't list sacrifices, years, or numbers. Explanations only matter when the people receiving them still value the truth, and I could already feel that truth didn't have a seat at their table anymore. Seconds later, Evelyn, my younger sister, reacted to my message. She didn't type a word. She didn't ask why. She didn't defend me. She simply tapped a celebratory emoji. A bright burst of digital confetti appeared beside my words, confirming unmistakably that my departure didn't cause tension. It brought relief. That single emoji from Evelyn felt louder than any argument we could have ever had. It was honest in a way conversations in my family rarely were. After it appeared, the group chat sank into a heavy, immovable silence. No one stepped in to soften the blow. No one offered concern. No one tried to repair the fracture they had created. The quiet felt intentional, sealed, final, like a door that had been closed long before anyone bothered to tell me. In that stillness, I finally understood something I should have recognized months earlier. The family I thought I belonged to had quietly reorganized itself without me. What I called loyalty had been redefined somewhere behind closed doors, and by the time I received the message, the decision was simply being delivered. That night did not end in tears or shouting. It ended with clarity. I had been removed, not accidentally, not impulsively, but by consensus from a family that valued my labor far more than my presence, and who celebrated once they no longer needed either. By morning, I woke with a certainty I hadn't felt in years. The room looked ordinary. The light slipped in as usual, but my thoughts were sharp, steady, and free of the constant pressure to fix problems that were never solely mine to carry. There was no anger driving me. There was no desire to prove anything. There was only a calm decision that had finished forming overnight. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and logged into the investment account. The one that had kept the restaurant afloat, patched emergencies, and bought time during crises my family pretended didn't exist. I entered the credentials without rushing, because I was no longer reacting. I wasn't trying to save something that had already chosen to live without me. The numbers appeared, clean and familiar. I reviewed them once, more from habit than doubt. Then I initiated the transfer. I withdrew the entire $312,000, the exact amount I had poured into keeping their business alive. I watched the confirmation load, feeling neither triumph nor sorrow. It felt procedural, like closing a chapter I had kept open far too long out of misplaced hope. Immediately after, I removed every layer of access they once had shared: permissions, linked devices, financial authorizations. Each click severed another thread they had long taken for granted. I did not hesitate. Hesitation had already cost me too much. I didn't worry about how it would look. I had spent years worrying about appearances while being erased in silence. Later that morning, I called my attorney, David Larson, who had assisted me on small legal matters in the past. This was the first time his role mattered beyond routine paperwork. I explained everything clearly, no exaggeration, no emotional bending, no ambiguity. He listened without interrupting. His silence didn't feel dismissive. It felt confirming. Once I finished, he only said, "I understand," with a tone that suggested none of it surprised him. Then David began preparing the legal boundaries I should have put in place years ago. David advised me to protect myself before the situation could twist into something legally dangerous. He reminded me that silence would shield me more effectively than emotional explanations, and that documentation would hold more weight than any conversation with people who had already made their decision. So that afternoon, I sat at my desk and drafted the email. I didn't overthink the wording. I didn't add emotion. I didn't include a single sentence about hurt or betrayal. I simply stated that I was terminating every legal and financial role tied to the restaurant. I clarified that any informal responsibilities were withdrawn effective immediately. I wrote that I would no longer be available for consultation, approvals, negotiation, or operational oversight of any kind. Before sending it, I read the message once not to reconsider, but to confirm accuracy. Then I clicked send. Afterward, I sat still, hands resting loosely in my lap. There was no dramatic rush of relief, no shaking, no thrill. Just a quiet understanding that I had finally stopped pouring energy into a place that had quietly stopped acknowledging my existence. I felt grounded, steady. For the first time in years, I did not reach for my phone to monitor reactions. I didn't brace for anger, or apologies, or arguments. I didn't prepare counterpoints. I knew the silence that would follow belonged to them, not to me. That morning marked a shift not because I raised my voice, but because I was done. 1 week later, cracks began to show everywhere. What had looked stable from a distance revealed a fragile core that no one inside the family wanted to acknowledge. I didn't have to stand close to the disaster to understand it. The warning signs arrived through people who had worked with us for years, and no longer sounded certain when they spoke. The first collapse came from our seafood suppliers. They stopped confirming delivery schedules. Invoices went unanswered. Trucks arrived late, or didn't arrive at all. Longtime partners who had once trusted a simple phone call now demanded formal guarantees, updated contracts, or proof of available funds before agreeing to anything. Others simply stopped responding altogether, creating an undercurrent of panic inside operations that relied on predictable supply lines. Soon after, employees began to leave. Some were candid, admitting they had heard rumors about instability and were afraid of payroll disruptions. Others left quietly, resignation letters emailed at midnight, lockers emptied before the next shift. I learned through former supervisors that staff members were worried not only about wages, but whether the restaurant could survive another month under leadership that seemed disjointed and unprepared. Then the banks and lenders stepped in. Existing loans were flagged for review. Documentation was requested again, this time with urgency. Legal departments began examining the business structure with an intensity they had never applied before. Agreements that once sailed through without hesitation were suddenly locked behind formal investigations. Clauses that had never mattered now mattered, and the legal language tightened around every transaction like a noose. The consequences of pushing me out had finally begun to surface. Inside the restaurant's operations, Evelyn was pushed into a level of visibility she had never experienced before. Auditors, outside consultants, and even informal investors began asking her direct questions about her responsibilities, her authority, and her understanding of the financial systems she had barely touched. She was suddenly expected to explain operational decisions she had never made and processes she had never managed. Meetings that once praised her confidence now revealed how little control she actually had when pressure became real. The room shifted. The tone shifted. Reality caught up. Rumors of civil filings surfaced quietly. Attorneys began reaching out for records, timestamps, and agreements. Several outside parties started discussing potential legal action tied to misrepresentation, financial exposure, and corporate negligence. What had once sounded like distant possibility turned into structured preparation, supported by documents I knew existed because I had once been the one organizing them. What struck me was not the chaos, but how predictable it all felt. For years, I had held fragile parts of the business together silently, without recognition or protection. When those supports disappeared, nothing replaced them. Decisions slowed, fear spread. Confidence collapsed privately long before the public saw any cracks. And my phone began to ring. Messages poured in more frequently, some from people who sounded nervous, others apologetic, and others speaking so carefully that their wording alone revealed how badly they wanted the situation repaired. But I did not answer. I did not respond. I watched from a distance that felt clean, controlled, and finally deserved. Mom and Dad faded from internal communications that once included them automatically. Martin and Janet no longer sounded confident in their private messages that eventually found their way to me through mutual contacts. Authority shifted into pure damage control, and even that lacked structure. Evelyn was left facing questions alone, carrying responsibilities she had never expected to shoulder without my guidance. By the end of the week, the business no longer looked stable from the inside. It looked exposed, vulnerable, stripped of the foundations it had relied on without acknowledging. I did not celebrate the unraveling. I did not feel satisfaction. What I felt was clarity. Consequences rarely arrive with noise. They arrive when silence can no longer hide the truth. 1 month later, my own life felt stable for the first time in years. I no longer woke up scanning messages or checking updates that were never meant for me. My phone stayed quiet for long stretches, and the silence felt earned, not empty, not punishing, simply peaceful. The distance I had created no longer felt like withdrawal. It felt like alignment. My mind finally understood something my heart had struggled to accept for too long. Peace does not require permission. It only requires letting go of the places that refuse to keep you whole. Mom was the first to reach out. Her name appeared on my screen early one morning, glowing quietly in the dim light of my bedroom. I watched it ring for a few seconds before letting it fade away. A few days later, Dad left a voicemail, his voice careful, unfamiliar, wrapped in a caution he had never used with me before. There were no demands this time. No assumptions. No pressure. Just hesitation, layered with politeness neither of them had felt the need to use when I was still carrying their burdens. They asked to meet privately, suggested we talk, proposed rebuilding without mentioning conditions. My parents framed it as a chance to come back, a chance to restore unity and fix what had broken. They spoke of respect. They referenced mistakes. They extended invitations to discuss new roles and balanced responsibilities. They insisted that everything could be repaired if I would just step back into the space they had pushed me out of. But I declined every time, every version without anger, without long explanations, and without hesitation. I chose a different structure for my life. I built routines that answered to my own standards instead of someone else's emergencies. I opened accounts that belonged solely to me, free of shared permissions or hidden obligations. My decisions no longer required negotiations or family approval. What once felt reckless now felt steady, like standing on solid ground after years of balancing on shifting sand. My work became focused. My growth became intentional. Stability became something I created, not something I begged to keep. Slowly, I stopped measuring my value through family roles or outdated expectations. The need to prove myself disappeared the moment I stepped out of rooms where performance had replaced genuine connection. My life became quieter in the best possible way, filled with predictable routines, honest effort, and outcomes that belonged entirely to my hands. Even my thoughts slowed down. It was as if my mind finally had the space to breathe without interruption, without criticism, without the constant fear of being erased. And through that quiet, I learned something I wish I had understood years ago. Boundaries are not rebellion. They are survival. They are self-respect, especially within families, where emotional history often substitutes for accountability. Drawing a line does not mean abandoning people. It means protecting the part of yourself that allows you to live without resentment, fear, or invisible debt. It means choosing peace over proximity when proximity has been weaponized. Real peace begins the moment you stop chasing validation from people who only valued the access you provided. If you stayed with my story to this moment, thank you for listening with openness, with honesty, and with a heart willing to understand. Your time matters, and your attention matters more than most stories ever admit. And if you felt even a small part of my journey in your own heart, I hope you'll share your thoughts below. Your comments remind me that healing isn't something we do alone, we do it together, through honesty and community. My story isn't just about loss. It's about learning to protect your peace, even when it means stepping away from people you once trusted. If you're carrying a similar burden, please remember this. Your worth isn't measured by what you give to others, but by how gently you choose to honor yourself. I'd love to hear your reflections, your voice truly matters here. And remember to like, subscribe, and stay connected for more real stories like this one.